The parts list and print settings can all be found on the printables page, which is linked in the description. We're going to start by making our hammer spring. You're going to want gloves on for this part because spring steel wants one thing, and that is to cut you. Take a cylinder slightly smaller than the pegs on the side of the hammer and use it to wrap 2 loops into the spring steel, about 50 millimeters apart from each other. It should make this mustache looking shape here. Now, take something square shaped and use it to make 2 90-degree angles on the mustache part. The finished spring should look like this, and it should fit onto the hammer like this. For this next step, you're going to need the hammer, a 608Z bearing, the bearing spacer, and a 5mm pin cut to 19mm. Now we're going to assemble the lower receiver. For the first step, you're going to need the lower receiver, the trigger, the disconnector, 2 springs, each 8mm in diameter and 10mm long, and one 5mm rod cut to 56mm in length. Stick one of the springs into the dimple in front of where the trigger goes, and then slot the trigger in to hold it down. Then, take the 5mm rod and push it in partially to hold the trigger in place. Now take the other spring, put it into the dimple in the trigger, install the disconnector, and push the pin the rest of the way through. Now take your hammer and put the hammer spring on it. Remember, it should look like this. Now slot the hammer in and pin it in place with another 5x56mm rod. The hammer should be under tension from the hammer spring at all times, even when it's forward. Now you're going to take the valve cap with an M6 heat set insert pushed into it, and you're going to pin it to the valve bar with a 38mm long 5mm rod. Once it's pinned in place, thread it onto the head of the valve and tighten it down. If your valve has a little knob on it, it should just unscrew to reveal M6 threads. Now with the valve bar attached, you're going to drop the valve into the lower receiver. You're going to use the nut on the neck of the valve to tighten it in place. Keep in mind that your HPA line will connect to the side of the valve with 2 holes in it, so plan that accordingly. I'm right-handed, so I have it on the left side. Now you're going to take the valve reset fin, insert it into the notch on the valve bar, fold it down so that it's flush with the lower receiver, and pin it in place with another 5x56mm rod. To finish off the lower receiver, you're going to install your magazine release. For this, you're going to need your lower receiver, your magazine release, a 10x10mm spring, and a 5x20mm rod. Now you're going to assemble the bolt. You will need the 2 bolt halves, the firing pin cap with a 5x104mm rod superglued into it, a 1-inch long 8x32 screw with matching nut, one 9.5x20mm spring, one 10x10mm spring, one 5x40mm steel rod, and the extractor. Start by taking the firing pin and sliding the 9.5x20mm spring over top of it. Then enclose it in the 2 bolt halves and secure it with the screw. The firing pin should be able to move freely forwards and backwards. If it can't, try sanding around the firing pin cap of the track it rides in and adding some grease to the track. Next, take the 10x10mm spring, drop it into the divot on the right side of the bolt, and hold it down with the extractor. Pin it in place with the 5x40mm rod. Next, you're going to take your gas piston and stretch 2 14x2.5mm O-rings over the 2 notches at the front. Be sure to add a generous amount of grease. Pin the gas piston to the bolt using a 5x35mm steel rod. It might wiggle up and down a little bit. This is perfectly normal. Now for the barrel assembly. I've already glued these parts together and I don't feel like reprinting them to show, so I'm just going to show you digitally. You're going to need 4 things for this part. 1 1/4-inch NPT fitting for 1/4-inch pneumatic tubing, the gas block, a length of 1-inch PVC pipe cut to 195mm, and the chamber. Start by supergluing the pneumatic fitting into the gas block. Then superglue the gas block into the PVC pipe. Finally, superglue the PVC pipe into the chamber, making sure that the back of the PVC pipe is flush with the back of the chamber. Next, take a 2-inch PVC pipe of your desired length and shove it into the chamber for the barrel. Use 2 1-inch 8x32 screws and matching nuts to secure it to the chamber. Now we're going to start assembling the upper receiver. Start by shoving the chamber in the front and securing it with two 2.5-inch 8x32 screws and matching nuts. Now you're going to install the ejector. Drop it into the slot right below the charging handle track and secure it in place with two 1/2-inch 8x32 screws and matching nuts. Slide the handguard onto the front of the chamber and secure it with two more 2.5-inch screws and nuts. Here's two more parts that I already glued and didn't feel like reprinting. Run an 80mm long 5mm rod through the charging handle and super glue that in. And glue a 200mm long rod into the spring guide cap. Stick the bolt into the upper receiver and then stick the charging handle into the bolt when the holes line up. The bolt should slide freely in the upper receiver. If it doesn't, add super lube to all the contact points where the bolt touches the receiver. This hole on the back of the upper receiver is where we're going to insert our spring guide and recoil spring. Ideally, you would use an 18 by 200mm long spring for the main recoil spring. I had two smaller springs on hand already, so that's why I used two split springs. This part's going to be a little bit fiddly. You want the end of the spring guide rod to go into the hole on the back of the gas piston. Once it's in, secure the spring guide rod with a 70mm long pin. And once again, the bolt should move freely. If it doesn't, grease it up. Now take a 70mm long pin and use it to pin the upper and lower receivers together. But wait! Newer models of the Manticore have a tab instead of a pin here, so you don't need to use a pin to fix the upper and lower together. Once the upper and lower are together, insert the stock plate to hold them together. On my own personal Manticore, I used a scar stock because I already had it on hand. There is a 3D printed stock available though. Once it's on, pin it in place with the printed pin. For the last step, we're going to do all the pneumatic stuff. I picked up this pneumatic tubing and connector set from Amazon, and all the parts you need can be found here. Besides that, you'll need a pneumatic tube to HPA fitting adapter to connect it to your HPA tank. I'll link both of these things in the description. Start by screwing the exhaust muffler into the port closest to the rear of the gun. This should have been in the package with the valve itself. Now take one of the pneumatic fittings with your HPA adapter connected and thread it into the slot in the front. I also added a 90-degree elbow to the tubing here to make it easier to connect to my HPA tank, but you don't have to do this if you don't want to. Now flip the gun over and add one more fitting to the slot on the other side. Make sure all these fittings are tight, otherwise you might end up with air leakage. Once everything's tightened down, use a length of 1/4 inch pneumatic tubing to connect the valve to the gas block. How you do your cable management is completely up to you. It doesn't matter as long as the tube connects the valve to the gas block without any kind of kinks or anything pinching the tube. I have chosen to run mine along the top rail and through the top of the handguard. Once that's all done, the gun is complete. Now that you've got the gun done, you're going to want some magazines. I designed these mags in segments, that way you can customize your magazine length. Each segment is 1 round, so a magazine with 3 segments would be 3 rounds. You can just print out as many segments as you want to make the magazines as long as you want. Now, there is an upper limit to how long the mags can be while still functioning properly. The longer they get, the harder it is to get them to feed. The most I was able to get to feed reliably is 5 rounds. All you need to do to assemble the magazine body is superglue your desired number of segments together. Just do a light ring of glue around the points where the 2 segments touch each other. My favorite superglue is Gorilla Glue Gel, but there are other options available. I'm not a huge fan of the actual superglue brand glue because it doesn't bond to PLA very well and it leaves a funny taste in my mouth when I eat it. When it comes to the actual composition of the magazine bodies, make sure that you have a set of feed lips at the top and a base plate mount at the bottom. Now we're going to use some more of that spring wire from the hammer spring to make our magazine springs. When making springs, always be sure to wear gloves and eye protection. You don't want to catch a piece of wire to the eye if it snaps or comes out of the vise. You're going to need something long and cylindrical to bend the spring around, about 3/4 of an inch in diameter. I'm using this old paint roller extension pole. Cut yourself maybe 2 to 3 feet of spring wire. Stick the end of the wire into a vise along with the end of whatever long cylindrical object you have chosen. Once it's all tightened down, you're just going to wrap the wire around the cylindrical object as tightly as you possibly can. In this specific situation, it is okay if the cylinder is harmed. And there is a learning curve to this. Your first couple springs might come out a little bit wonky, and that's totally okay. These springs don't need to be super precise, and you can always try again. When you run out of wire, carefully release tension and then stretch the spring out a bit. Once it's all stretched out, clip the ends, and then you have your finished magazine spring. Now that your magazine body is all glued together and you've made your springs, you can assemble the magazine. For this, you'll need a base plate button, a magazine spring, a follower, and your magazine body. Start by sticking your follower in through the bottom and then the magazine spring after it. Remember that the length of your magazine spring depends on the length of your magazine. Your magazine spring should be just a little bit longer than the magazine itself. For the final step, take your base plate button and use it to hold down the magazine spring while you slide the base plate on. When loaded, the tension from the spring should keep the shells from falling out. Now that you've got the gun and mags to feed it with, you're going to want to know how to use it. Set your regulator to about 40 psi, and make sure to rack the bolt before you plug in your HPA. Racking the bolt sets the hammer into the ready position. If the hammer isn't in the ready position when you connect your HPA, it will automatically set itself to the ready position. This isn't bad or anything, you might just smash your fingers when the bolt spontaneously racks itself. To fire the Manticore, insert a loaded magazine, rack the charging handle, and pull the trigger. If you have a round in the chamber and you want to put the gun on safe, you can pull the bolt back slightly, pull the trigger, and then let the bolt back forward. To take it off safe again, pull the charging handle back slightly, and then let it forward. Congratulations, you now know how to assemble and operate a Manticore grenade launcher. If you have any questions or need any additional help, feel free to leave a comment or message me.